doing a commentary of it today on World War II in Asia. Alright, so basically, World War II in Asia began when Japan would. Actually, no, there was some stuff before it. I'm gonna start in the 1930s. Japan. Actually, no, after World War I, Japan had built themselves some sort of an empire. They had been expanding, and they joined the Allies during World War I, and they had took many German colonies in Asia. Like, there were a bunch of islands here they took. Anyways, after World War I, the Japanese Empire was beginning, and it still wanted to continue further expanding. The Japanese Empire right now needed oil and resources, which were coming thin on their island. In 1910, before World War I, they invaded Korea, and they annexed it for its resources. They got in a bit of a scuffle with Russia, and they took this territory. A while back, they also colonized these islands, and a few here too. And they also, I think during their war with China, they took Taiwan too. After World War I, they annexed these islands from Germany. They were former German colonies. They also annexed a small colony here in Shandong. I think it was called Taising Tao or something. I don't know, but something like that. They annexed those colonies, and Japan still wanted to continue expanding, since they felt that the expansion they got from the war was not enough, as they still needed resources. So, in 1931, I think it was called, they staged an incident where a Japanese train blew up in Manchuria. And, they staged it, obviously. And when they did that, it gave them an excuse to invade, or a casus belli on China. And they used this casus belli to annex Manchuria. And they invaded it. They still didn't have the resources that they needed, though, and they felt that they still needed to continue expanding. So I believe in 1936, the Axis, right now, had just started in Europe, and Japan would join it. I believe somewhere in the 1940s, actually no, 1936, on the Yangtze River, Japanese aircraft would attack, I believe, a few Chinese boats that were in the river. Anyways, the Japanese attacked them with their air force. An American ship called the Panier, I believe, was also in the region, carrying oil. The Japanese saw this, and they believed it was a Chinese ship, and they attacked it, and they sunk it. The loss of the Panier was heard across the United States, and it would sour relations between Japan and America, which would soon lead to the war. Anyways, Japan, I believe in 1940, launched an invasion into China. The Chinese states right now, which were fractured as China was going through a civil war, decided to come together, and they decided to form the National Liberation Front. I believe it was called that. Basically, they signed a treaty with all the Chinese states, and would assist each other in pushing the Japanese forces out, and they would completely liberate China. The liberation forces got together and fought with the Japanese ruthlessly. Although the Japanese pushed hard into China, they took this territory here, they took Peking, they also took Shanghai, and after Peking was lost, which was the Chinese capital, I believe, of the communist state, they pushed south to China's then capital, I believe. They moved the capital to Nanking after they got pushed out of Peking, which would see Japan's worst atrocities during the war against the Chinese people. The communist forces, after losing at Nanking, decided to up their ante and decided to start producing more and more weapons to push out the Japanese. Anyways, after Nanking, they started landing on small little coastal strips on the Chinese border here. Also, during this time, the Japanese wanted to start expanding south of them and into American islands, which there were many of them, in the Pacific. Well, during World War II, there weren't too many, but there were a few. Plus, the Philippines was also an American colony, and they really wanted it for its oil and other resources. So, in 1942, the Japanese decided to start a war with the US. They had prepared their Air Force and Navy. Well, I believe it was actually their Air Force which did it. And they decided to attack Hawaii, which would be known as the Pearl Harbor Incident. The Japanese Air Forces crossed the Hawaiian Islands and attacked. They bombed many of the American Air Force ships. No, not Air Force. They might have damaged the Air Force, but mainly they wanted to damage their Navy so they could start expanding over the Pacific. They attacked many of their ships and other things in the island. People suffered through it, although the attack ended. After the Pearl Harbor incident, America was left disgusted, and they decided to go to war with Japan, which was starting to annoy them for a while. Anyways, the war with Japan also saw them go to war with the Axis, which Germany was not happy about. Anyways, Japan had damaged the American Navy, which meant they could start expanding over the Pacific. They landed at the Wake Island, I believe. They also took the Philippines. They also went to war in the Indies. They took the Dutch East Indies. They also swept by any British colonies here. They also took Singapore, Malaya, New Guinea, and they started attacking Australia from the north. They also took some islands around here. I don't know about this though. They also invaded French Indochina, which was part of the Free French movement, and they took it and started a new front from the south attacking China. I'm not sure how well that would go, but they did start it. They also forced Thailand to join them and started fighting in Burma, although they weren't prepared for the harsh jungle there. Anyways, the Japanese had just greatly expanded over the Pacific, and things were looking quite well for them. They had a lot of resources now, but they still wanted way more, and they wanted to conquer the entire East in something they called the Grand Prosperity Co., I think. I think it was called that. It was like the Japanese sort of coalition. I'm not sure how well it did, though, since they were in the Axis. But, yeah. Anyways, the Grand Prosperity Co. was going pretty well. The plans on conquering the East were also going well, until a turning point. After the landings in Normandy, Japan started failing in the East. I believe they attacked Midway, as they now planned on invading the Hawaiian Islands. The battle at Midway was... The battle at Midway was brutal. The Japanese Navy was ready, but the American forces were also ready, and the American forces completely destroyed the Japanese Navy, as it was severely damaged. It would be also a battle which the Japanese Navy would never recover from. Anyways, after the battle there, the Japanese Navy was severely weakened, which meant American forces could start liberating territories that Japan had taken. They started taking islands that Japan had taken after World War I, and they also retook the Wake Island. With British assistance and Australian forces, they landed their forces here and pushed them out of these islands. They also landed in New Guinea from the south and from the east here, and they started pushing them out of the Indies. Their front in Burma also started failing, as they started getting pushed into Thailand. They also started getting pushed back in China, and they had I can't speak. They had to put the front at stalemate in order to keep the Chinese from pushing them any further. Right now, things were not going well for Japan. Japan was starting to get pushed further and further out of their islands here, and the Americans were starting to get closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, which was bad. Japan could not handle a mainland invasion, as they hadn't prepared much for it. They hoped the war would be won before anything could attack their mainland. Anyways, the battles in the Philippines would be brutal, but with the American Navy and Air Force ready, they pushed them out. I'm not sure if they landed in Taiwan, but they might have. Anyways, a ruthless battle here in Iwo Jima would be had, where American forces ruthlessly and victoriously took the island. Japan, though, decided to up their game and decided to start attacking the Americans with everything they had. They launched kamikaze attacks, which consisted of launching the planes that knew they were going to lose at the American Navy ships and other forces, which didn't see the pilot survive. These were called kamikazes, as it was seen as the most honorable thing to do during the war. The coastal strips here were starting to be liberated, and American forces decided to, I'm not sure what they did with Taiwan, but one of the ruthless battles would then commence in the Ryukyu Islands, I think. I don't know what it's called, but I think it was at Okinawa, which would see one of the bloodiest battles of the war, where American forces would land on the final islands to the Japanese mainland. The Japanese fought ruthlessly. They would also see many deserters during the war, as many of them would flee, although there wasn't really anywhere to flee from on the islands. Anyways, the Japanese lost Okinawa, and the Americans knew that Japan wasn't going to surrender. The Manhattan Bomb Project, which they had been working on before, was just in case the Axis won and they started taking over the world, and they would become first. But they had decided to start producing the Manhattan Bomb Project even more when they went to war with the Japanese and the Axis. By now, it was sort of ready, and they wanted to test it. Also, the USSR the war had already been won in Europe, and the USSR was starting to occupy its territories instead of liberating them. So the Americans decided to test out their nukes to sort of impress the USSR. And the first nuke would be dropped on Hiroshima. The nuke devastated the city. Japan was left weakened by this. Although Japan still refused to surrender, the Americans decided to drop a second nuke on them. The first nuke was launched at Hiroshima, I think, and the second nuke then landed on Nagasaki. Nagasaki was a pretty big city during this time, and so was Hiroshima. Without these two cities giving them major resources, and the Japanese people suffering from the radiation and damages that had just happened to its country, Japan decided to surrender. The surrender of Japan, the war in Asia then ended, as harsh treaties would be delivered against them. I believe Japan was occupied for a very short time, but it wouldn't be as long as Europe. And, actually, I'm not sure if they did occupy Japan. I'm pretty sure they might have. But they didn't depose Hirohito, because he didn't die at the end of it, and he actually still remained ruler of Japan afterwards. I believe that he should have been deposed, though, and they should have, at least banished him, or, gotten rid of him. But anyways, he continued to rule Japan for his short time as emperor, and Japan was no longer an empire after the war. Many years of harsh suffering happened during the Japanese rule over its territories, and it had finally come to an end. It had been a celebration across China when the Japanese forces surrendered, and after the Japanese forces surrendered, the Civil War continued in China, which would see a communist victory, and it would see the communist China we also have today. Alright, that's the history of World War II in Asia, I believe. I'm cutting it off. That's the commentary of it for today.